Why are you forcing me to marry a man I don't love? Have I not given enough to this family?
Juliet, our families have been at odds for decades. Something has to give.
In Lagos, there were two kinds of power: the kind people prayed for and the kind people feared. The Davies family had both. So did the Dukes. For over 2 decades, these two families had ruled Lagos business with iron fists and pointed them at each other. Contracts were stolen, deals were sabotaged. If the Davies built a door, the Dukes found a way to shut it. If the Dukes opened a road, the Davies made sure it led nowhere. It was war. Expensive, exhausting, and very, very personal. Nobody remembered exactly how it started, but everybody knew it had gone too far. Juliet Davies knew the rivalry like she knew her own name. She had grown up watching her father come home tight-jawed and furious after every encounter with the Dukes. She had sat in boardrooms at 24, sharp-tongued and unafraid, defending her family's interests with a precision that made grown men uncomfortable. She was her father's daughter, bold, brilliant, and built for battle. Charles Duke was everything she expected from the enemy: cold, calculated, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately owned it without saying a word. He had taken over the Duke business operations at 26 and had not lost a single major deal since. Nobody crossed Charles Duke twice. They had never had a real conversation. They didn't need to. Their last names said enough. But by the middle of that year, the war was bleeding both families dry. 3 failed mergers, 2 court cases, 1 very public fallout at the Lagos Business Summit that made the newspapers. The cost of fighting each other had become greater than the cost of losing. Something had to give. On a quiet Thursday evening, inside a private dining room at the top of Oriental Hotel, Raymond Davies and Gerald Duke sat across from each other for the first time without lawyers present. 2 old men, 2 tired men. They talked for 3 hours. When they finally stood to leave, they shook hands, and they made a decision that neither Juliet nor Charles would see coming. Nobody asked them. That was the part that stung the most. The decision was made without their consent. When Juliet's father sat her down and told her about the agreement, she laughed because she was sure he was joking. When she realized he wasn't, the laugh died in her throat. She argued for 2 hours straight. She threatened, she reasoned, she reminded him that she had given everything to the Davies name. Her time, her energy, her 20s, and that this was how he chose to repay her. Raymond Davies listened to every word. Then he told her the decision was final. Across town, Charles received the news with complete silence. He sat across from his father, Gerald Duke, and did not raise his voice once. He simply asked if there was another way. His father said no. Charles nodded slowly, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room. That silence was more terrifying than any argument. The wedding was everything Lagos expected it to be. The venue was breathtaking, the guest list was a who's who of Nigerian power and wealth. Cameras flashed, champagne poured, speeches were made about unity, legacy, and new beginnings. Juliet smiled because she was a Davies. She knew how to perform. Charles stood beside her like a man made of stone. They exchanged vows with steady voices and unreadable faces. When the officiant said Charles could kiss his bride, he leaned in and placed the most formal, bloodless kiss on her cheek. The crowd cheered. Juliet's smile did not waver, but her jaw tightened. Later that night, they arrived at the Duke family home, a wide, beautifully furnished mansion that now belonged to both of them. The staff had prepared everything. The house was quiet. Charles carried his own bag into the living room and set it down. He looked at Juliet once. He said, "You can take the master bedroom. I'll sleep here." He didn't wait for her response. Juliet stood in the middle of the room, still in her wedding dress, watching him settle into the sofa like a man who had already made peace with a decision she was still fighting. She said nothing. She turned and walked upstairs. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But alone in that big, quiet bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. The house was still. The celebration was over, and she was married to a man who couldn't even share a room with her. She heard movement downstairs around midnight. Slow, quiet footsteps. She held her breath and listened. What kind of man had she married? She didn't have an answer yet. But something told her the man sleeping on that sofa was not entirely the man she thought she knew. A week into the marriage, they had found a routine. It was a cold one, but it was a routine. Charles woke before the sun. By the time Juliet came downstairs each morning, there was already a cup of tea on the counter, and he was gone, disappeared into his study or out the door before she could say a word. She told herself she was glad. The less they crossed paths, the easier this would be. She focused on work. The Davies business still needed her, merger or not. She left early, came home late, ate whatever the housekeeper prepared, and went straight to bed. This was survivable. She had survived worse. Then one Tuesday evening, she came home later than usual. She was exhausted in a way that sat deep in her bones. She dropped her bag at the door, walked into the kitchen expecting nothing, and stopped. A covered plate sat on the counter. She lifted the lid. Jollof rice, fried plantain, and grilled chicken. Her favorite, prepared exactly the way she liked it. She didn't know how anyone in this house would know that, but the plantain was soft in the middle, and the rice had that smoky bottom she could never resist. She assumed it was the housekeeper. She ate and said nothing. But it happened the next night, and the night after that. On the fourth night, she went to the housekeeper directly. "Ada," she said carefully, "the meals, thank you, but you didn't have to." Ada shook her head before she could finish. "It wasn't me, ma." A short pause. "It was Mr. Charles." Juliet said nothing for a long moment. "He asked me for your favorite meals the day after the wedding," Ada continued quietly. "He has been preparing them himself when he gets back before you." Juliet walked away without responding. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she filed it somewhere quiet in her chest and kept moving. That Friday night, she brought work home, reports spread across the living room sofa, laptop open, reading glasses on. She told herself she would go upstairs soon. She always told herself that. She woke up at 2 a.m. with a blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders. Her laptop had been closed and set aside. The reports were stacked neatly on the table. She sat up slowly and looked around the empty living room. The house was silent, but someone had been there. Someone had stood over her while she slept and done this quietly, without leaving a trace of themselves behind except this blanket and this small, impossible kindness. She pulled the blanket tighter without meaning to. Charles Duke had covered her while she slept. The cold, calculated man her family had warned her about, that man had stood in the dark and made sure she was warm. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she made a decision. Tomorrow night, she would not fall asleep. She would stay awake and she would wait for him.
Juliet had arranged everything exactly as she always did. Reports spread across the sofa, glasses on, laptop open. But the words on the screen meant nothing tonight. She was not working. She was waiting. She controlled her breathing and kept her eyes closed when she heard the study door open just after midnight. His footsteps were slower than she imagined, more careful, like a man who had taught himself to move through the world without disturbing it. She had him lift the blanket from the armchair. She felt him stop beside her, and then she opened her eyes. The room was dim, lit only by the low light above the kitchen counter. Charles stood over her, blanket in hand, completely still. He was not the boardroom man in that moment. No armor, no coldness. Just a man caught doing something he had never intended anyone to see. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, without breaking eye contact, he leaned forward and laid the blanket over her anyway. He straightened up and turned to leave. "Why do you do this?" Her voice was quiet, not accusatory, just honest. Charles stopped walking. His back was to her. A silence stretched between them, long enough that she thought he would simply ignore the question and disappear down the hallway. Then he spoke, because nobody should be cold in their own home. He didn't turn around. He didn't wait for her reply. He just walked away and left her sitting with those words in the dark. Juliet did not sleep for a long time after that. The next morning was different. Not warm, but different. The sharp edge that usually filled the kitchen when they occupied it at the same time had dulled slightly. Charles came out of his study to find his coffee already made, sitting exactly at the temperature he preferred. He looked at it for a moment, then at the empty kitchen, then sat down and drank it without a word. That evening, Juliet noticed his jacket hanging off the back of a chair near the staircase, the one he always forgot on his way to his study. She picked it up without thinking and folded it neatly outside his study door. She was halfway up the stairs before she realized what she had done. She didn't go back. Neither of them spoke about any of it. No acknowledgement, no sudden warmth over dinner. But something was shifting underneath the silence, slow and quiet like a tide change. They were still strangers, but they were becoming strangers who paid attention to each other. And paying attention, Juliet was learning, was its own kind of language. She was beginning to understand his. Then, on a Wednesday evening, everything nearly fell apart. She was passing the hallway outside his study when she heard his voice through the door, low, controlled, but tighter than usual. She slowed without meaning to. "I don't care what they're saying." A pause. "If this gets out, it won't just affect the merger." Another pause, longer this time. Then, quietly, in a voice she had never heard from him before, "It will destroy everything." Juliet stood very still in the hallway. Whatever was on that phone call, it was bigger than a business problem. And something told her it had everything to do with why their fathers had forced this marriage in the first place.
She tried to ignore it. For 2 days, Juliet went about her routine. Early mornings, long hours, quiet evenings, and told herself that whatever she had overheard outside Charles's study was not her business. They were not that kind of married. They did not owe each other explanations. But on the third morning, Charles came out of his room, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. He was dressed. He was always dressed, but there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His jaw was tight in a different way than usual, not controlled, strained. She put down her cup. What happened? He looked at her. For a moment, she thought he would deflect, give her the version of himself that revealed nothing. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "There are people inside my family," he said slowly, "who do not want this merger to work." He told her everything. A faction within the Duke family, distant relatives with old grudges and fresh greed, had been leaking information, quietly poisoning business relationships, trying to collapse the agreement from the inside. If the merger fell apart, the peace agreement fell with it. And so did their marriage. Juliet listened without interrupting. "I've known about the tension for weeks," Charles said. "I've been trying to handle it quietly." He paused. "I didn't want you pulled into it." "I'm already in it," she said. "I've been in it since the day they told me I was marrying you." Something shifted in his expression. Then he said something she never expected. "My father started this war." His voice was low and careful, like a man placing something fragile on a table. "Not yours. Years ago, he made moves against the Davies that were calculated and cruel. He has never admitted it. I have never said it out loud." He looked at her steadily. "But I have carried it for a long time." The room was very quiet. Juliet felt something loosen inside her chest, a knot she had been holding so long she had forgotten it was there. "I never wanted any of this," she said quietly. "The rivalry, the performance. I have spent my entire life being what my family needed me to be. I am so tired, Charles." It was the first true thing she had said out loud in years. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Then Charles reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. She looked down at it, then up at him. She did not pull away. They sat like that in the morning light. No walls, no performance, no armor. Just two people finally meeting each other honestly for the first time. It was the most intimate moment of their marriage, and it had taken no words to begin it. The next morning, Juliet reached for her phone and felt her stomach drop. 11 missed calls from her father, and a single message that read, "It's in the papers, all of it. Call me now." The story was everywhere. By 7 a.m., it had hit 3 major blogs, 2 newspapers, and was trending on Lagos Twitter. The headline was ugly. Duke Davies merger on the brink. Insider sources reveal cracks in new business empire.
There were quotes from anonymous sources, speculation about a forced marriage, questions about the stability of both families. Her father called first, then his. Within 20 minutes, both patriarchs were on a group call, voices raised, each one convinced the other's family had leaked the story. Raymond Davies spoke over Gerald Duke. Gerald Duke refused to back down. Two old men who had spent decades sharpening their tongues on each other, falling back into the only rhythm they had ever known. Juliet and Charles sat in the living room listening. She looked at him. He looked at her. He ended the call. She stared at him. They'll call back furious. Let them, he said. For the first time, she saw it clearly. Charles was not his father. He never had been. He simply inherited a war he didn't start and carried it the only way he knew how, quietly, alone. We handle this ourselves, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Together. The press conference was held by noon at the Duke business headquarters. No parents, no lawyers speaking on their behalf, just Charles and Juliet, side by side, composed and completely united. Charles spoke first. He addressed every rumor directly, without flinching. The merger was not crumbling. The families were not divided. Anyone working to suggest otherwise had their own agenda, and it would not succeed. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to hide and everything left to protect. Then Juliet stepped forward. The Davies and Duke families have not always seen eye to eye, she said, her voice carrying clean and clear across the room. That is not a secret. But what is also not a secret is this. We are here, together, and we are not going anywhere. She paused. You do not have to believe in this merger, but you will respect it. The room was silent for a bit. Then cameras clicked. Journalists scribbled. The narrative shifted in real time. By evening, the tone online had completely changed. That night, the house was quiet in a different way. Not the cold quiet of two strangers keeping distance. Something softer, something that finally had room to breathe. Juliet was in the living room when Charles came downstairs. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and she looked up at him. No words were exchanged. She simply shifted on the sofa and made space beside her. He sat down. They watched the city lights through the wide window, Lagos glittering and indifferent below them, unbothered by the wars men fought in its name. Later, when she looked over, Charles had fallen asleep beside her. For the first time since she had known him, he looked unguarded, no armor, no calculation, just a man finally at rest. She reached for the blanket on the armchair. She covered him gently. Then she sat back and looked at him for a long, quiet moment and felt something settle inside her, like the last piece of something that had always been incomplete. The Davies and the Dukes had spent 20 years building walls between them. It took two people brave enough to stop performing and start seeing each other to tear them all down. The greatest thing two people can do for each other is simply this: show up honestly, not perfectly, not fearlessly, but honestly. Everything else follows from there.